All right, so we are back. This is We've Been New. I'm your host, Cheyenne Doom, and this is arc one of the series, which is naming the distortion. So we're about 3 weeks into the Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. This book was written, it was actually published in 1933. And I keep having to remind myself of that because the further that I get into it, I feel like I'm reading a report that was filed last Tuesday. This week, I'm in chapters 8 through 12, and I want to be very, very clear about something before we get into it. What Woodson is documenting in these chapters is not neglect, it is not oversight, it is not well-intentioned people that are making mistakes. What he is laying out in painstaking detail is architecture. A system designed with intention, calibrated with precision, and maintained across generations so that the outcomes we see today, the unemployment rates, the wealth gap, the political marginalization, the infighting, the misleaders, would appear to be natural, right? It would appear to be our fault, but they are not our fault. And Woodson knew that in 1933. So let's get into this. And this is chapter 8. Chapter 8 is titled Professional Education Discouraged. Professional Education Discouraged. And right away, Woodson is giving very specific documented examples of how the professional development of Black people was actively sabotaged. Actively, not passively blocked, but actively sabotaged. He talks about a law in Delaware where a man could not be admitted to the bar without practicing under a licensed attorney for a year. And get this though, no white lawyer would take a Black attorney on. So the law wasn't technically discriminatory on its face, but the enforcement of it was. The outcome, it was guaranteed before the attempt was even made. And then he shares something from his own experience that I could not stop thinking about. He had been working with a Black lawyer on a transaction for 6 months. 6 months. And it wasn't even anything that was rocket science. But nothing was moving because the white attorney on the other side refused to deal with the Black attorney. But when Woodson shows up himself, because he's like, look, I'm tired, this is taking too long. He shows up as a school teacher, not a lawyer. The white attorney is suddenly ready to talk business because a teacher in his mind was in his place. A peer who happened to be Black? Ooh, that was too much. Like, do you understand what kind of worldview you have to hold to feel threatened by a professional peer? But you're perfectly comfortable with someone that you see as a subordinate? What kind of insecurity is that? And I'm not even asking that rhetorically. I genuinely want people to sit with that and what it says about the psychology of white supremacy. It was never about qualification at all. It was quite simply about threat. Black competence in proximity to white authority was the actual problem. And we are watching this same thing happen right now. Prior to this current administration coming in, regardless of how they try to gaslight us, we could already see the numbers. We could already see who was and wasn't in executive leadership, on boards of directors. And then I remember this. Organizations started quietly scrubbing their websites. Leadership team, pages with pictures, gone, because they knew what the data was going to show, and they wanted to control what the optics were going to be before anyone started asking any questions. And then, day one of this administration, they gutted the EEOC, turned it into a vehicle for calling DEI reverse racism. I don't even have the bandwidth for the mental gymnastics required there, but the mechanism is the same one Woodson was documenting back in his time. So all you got to do is just update the interface. Anyway, he goes through medicine, architecture, engineering, chemistry, dramatics, field after field, where the same pattern repeats. The white establishment tells Black people they cannot excel there. They have no future there. And then enough of that gets internalized. The people stop thinking. And then the lack of representation gets used as evidence that Black people don't belong in those spaces. It's a closed loop. Because here's the thing that Woodson points to, and it's the thing that they were not saying out loud. They were afraid of the competition. Because when the barriers do come down, when Black people are actually given proper support and real opportunity, in many cases, we don't just survive, we surpass, we dominate. And I'm not saying that to be boastful. I'm saying that because it explains the level of energy that has been harvested and invested across centuries in maintaining these very barriers. You don't build a machine this elaborate to keep out someone that you aren't afraid of. Now we're going to get to chapter 9, political education neglected. And this is where it starts to get really diabolical to me. Woodson documents that Black children were being educated without access to the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Not because they were accidentally left out of the curriculum, but there's a legislative record of someone killing a bill that would have printed the Constitution in the school histories, specifically by arguing on the record that it would never do to have the Negroes study the Constitution. Because if they read it, they might learn to contend for the rights guaranteed in it. Again, this is not negligence. This is a plan. And then this is the part that made me physically exhausted. Those same children, grown into adults, would try to register to vote, and they would be given a test. Expound this section of the Constitution. Answer this question about this amendment. Questions Woodson notes that had baffled even the high courts. You were being tested on material that you were deliberately never taught, and the trap was complete. I first encountered this passage that's in this chapter, the one about controlling thought, when I was actually reading Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview. That's actually the book that put me onto Woodson. I think I told you guys that last week. And so when I read that the first time, it hit me so hard because I could pinpoint the specific moments in my own life where I had walked toward the back door. And I'm going to actually read that to you. If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. Whew. I really think about the times where I had to make myself feel smaller than I needed to, where I had accepted a ceiling without even pushing against it. And reading it here in this context, in Woodson's argument, it really lands differently. It lands as a structural diagnosis. And this whole architecture is explained in that quote right there. And I think about the oral history piece of this. He's talking about a population that was also not having family stories passed down. And I can speak directly to that. My mother doesn't have stories that were handed down to her. Everything she knows about her own lineage, She has had to excavate through genealogy records, in fact. I never met my father, so there's nothing coming from that side. And the institutional silence and the familial silence, they actually work together. You don't know what was done, so you don't know how bad it is, so that you don't get angry enough to do something about the fact that it's still happening. And then this is the part that really gets me. And I'm going to flip-flop in the usage of the term, but Negroes in some communities were themselves policing the conversation, telling teachers not to bring up political thought because the races are getting along amicably here, and we don't want to get that disturbed. And Woodson was clear about what that actually means. Those communities, they had been so thoroughly terrorized that silence had become self-preservation, even though we know today that that was self-sabotage. They couldn't even discuss politics publicly. Think about the massacre in Tulsa. Think about what happened every single time Black people built something. The threat was real, and the silence, it was rational under these conditions. But the conditions were created for exactly that purpose. So then we get to chapter 10, and this is titled The Loss of Vision. And this is where I started to feel a particular kind of exhaustion. Because Woodson begins comparing the courage of 18th century Black America to the accommodation of his own era. And I have to keep reminding myself that this is 1933, that he's writing from. He's already watching a kind of retreat, a drift towards compromise that he calls moral surrender. And this is about 3 generations after Reconstruction. He talks about the educated Negro who, instead of building something, finds it easier to exploit the community he came from, to collect rent from people who can't go elsewhere, to take fees from people who don't even know they're being overcharged, to join the system of segregation in exchange for a slightly larger apartment in the ghetto. And he is not letting these individuals fully off the hook, but he is also being very precise about the conditions that produce that type of behavior. So miseducation, it doesn't just make you ignorant of history. It shapes your ambitions. It shapes what you think is possible. It shapes what you decide to settle for. We're in that same exact readjustment moment that he is describing. AI is displacing labor. This administration is actively pushing Black people out of the workforce. The economic floor is dropping. And just like he was asking in 1933, what is the plan? What are we building? What are we pulling toward? All right, so now we're getting into chapters 11 and 12, and this is where Woodson gets into the leadership question. He describes what he calls the misleader, and it's not about talking about bad leaders in the generic sense, but he's talking about a specific type of figure who is identified, financed, given publicity, and positioned by the enemies of the race, specifically to redirect the community, to keep it contained, and to give people someone to follow who will never actually lead them anywhere that threatens the system. And he traces this mechanism back through slavery. The house Negro who was cultivated to report on the others, to keep order, to prevent the assembly of any real collective power. And then after emancipation, the same function was actually performed by whoever is willing to take the deal. The politician who rounds up votes in exchange for Jim Crow appointments with no real power. The minister who shows up on Sunday in a Cadillac and leaves with the congregation's money. The educator who preaches self-help while personally profiting from the community's lack of access to alternatives. And I thought about Fred Hampton. I thought about COINTELPRO. I thought about those documents. I thought about how consistently, how deliberately the federal government identified and neutralized Black leadership that was actually organizing real power. And then I thought about What filled that vacuum? Celebrities. And we know that this is not a coincidence. When the civil rights leaders, we've got Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, when these civil rights leaders were assassinated and surveilled, imprisoned, discredited, the cultural figures who rose to that symbolic space, the rappers, the entertainers, they were operating in an industry that had its own interests to protect. And some of them, some of the most visible ones, were being actively invested in, promoted, and amplified. And it's specifically because of what they represented about Black life, not in spite of it. I think about the music that is crossed over. I think about what gets funded and what doesn't. I think about the images that are being circulated at mass scale and suburban living rooms versus what quietly gets kept out of view. The more damaging to the Black community and the image, the more likely it is to find investment. The more derogatory toward Black women, the more airplay it gets. That birth of a nation logic running through a streaming platform. And I think about how last week I was actually helping to co-facilitate for a Black History Month event. And I was talking to our cousins from across, I'd say from across the pond, people who were African born, who have come here to the US and who are studying here. And it was being explained to me that there really wasn't anything being taught about slavery and what was truly being done to us Black Americans over here. And the only images that they were being shown were violence and drugs. And the first thing that came to mind was, now mind you, we didn't even invent any of that. We didn't bring guns into our neighborhoods. We didn't bring drugs into our neighborhoods. And yet that's imagery that is being associated with us and about us to people in other countries, so that psychologically they will also subscribe to the thought of, see, look, they're doing it to themselves. They don't want to be better. Ooh, diabolical. So I know that the intent is recognizable, and I know that years later, some of those same figures, the ones that are performing for this administration, tap dancing for the most vehemently racist political apparatus of my generation's lifetime. And Woodson is describing exactly this. The misleader who has been given enough money and enough accolades and street credibility that when the time comes, he can be used. And many will follow him because he is the one that they recognize as representing the community. And this is what Woodson meant by representation without power. It's optics, it's symbol, and it is the Jim Crow job with the title and no authority. And then you get to the infighting. Ooh. So chapter 11 spends a lot of time on this. The competition for scarce positions, the cannibalizing of community efforts, the ways that we are limiting access to leadership roles, creating factions that spend all of their energy fighting each other instead of building anything. He says, the ambitious miseducated Negro and the struggle for the little things allotted by others prevents any achievement of the people in matters more constructive. And I see this right now. I see organizations doing parallel work with no coordination. I see funding going to the most palatable face, the prettiest package, the ones that make so-called allies comfortable. I see people who are actually doing the work. And they're on the ground, they're in the community without any safety net, being forced to compete against each other for the same shrinking pool of resources. And those resources are being deliberately pulled. The funding that was meant to address racial injustice, to heal what has been broken, gone. And so service-oriented people are fighting for scraps, while hoarded wealth is being used for destruction and distraction. And the cycle continues because it was designed to continue. All right. But Woodson, he doesn't leave it there. And this is the part that I want to sit in for a moment because it's where the week's reading lands for me personally. He draws a distinction between leadership and service. And it is not a semantic difference. It is a structural one. Under leadership, he says we came into the ghetto. By service within the ranks, we may work our way out of it. The servant of the people is not on a high horse. The servant lives among the people, works as they work, knows what they know, and brings whatever additional knowledge or experience they carry as a resource for the community, not as a credential for elevation above it. And here is where he says, whoever is greatest among you, let him be your servant. And that lands differently if you've been, reading these chapters about what false leadership has actually cost our community. Because the servant model is the thing that actually builds something. The servant doesn't need to be seen. The servant doesn't need a title. The servant is measuring success by what the people can do when the work is done, not by how many people are following them. And I'm sitting with this in the context of my own life and my own work. I went to USC for about 1.5 years, prestigious program, rigorous education, all of it. And I am grateful for what I learned there. But I could also see almost from the beginning, not actually almost from the beginning, the gap between what that education was training me for and the work I was actually being called to do. The formal credential and the actual calling, they were not the same thing. And so like Woodson says, and like Dr. Myers says, it affirms for me what I went looking for in my own education. I went looking for the knowledge that wasn't in the curriculum. And it is that search that led me to this series, to this work, to the journals that I'm writing, the healing circles that I'm facilitating, the board I'm sitting on at Safe Black Space, the books that I am co-writing. All of this is service. All of this is trying to contribute something that actually moves people towards liberation rather than something that is just a more comfortable version of the confinement. And that's why I also struggle with what to even call myself. But I think about the timing. I am reading this book, Woodson's book, during the 100th anniversary of Black History Month, a month that Carter G. Woodson himself established. And that is not nothing. That is something that needs to be honored. Woodson also says the average Negro has not been sufficiently miseducated to become hopeless. He still believes that there are enough of us who have not been fully captured into the system. Enough of us who are oriented towards something real. Enough of us who, if given the right conditions and the right knowledge, will choose to build rather than compete for the scraps. And that's the bet We Been New has been making. That's the bet that this whole series is built on. So Woodson closes this particular section of the book from Frederick Douglass. And I want to end here because it has been sitting with me all week. Douglass said, "It is vain that we talk of being men if we do not the work of men." 100 years since this book was published, 100 years since Woodson sat down and documented in meticulous, painful, infuriating detail the exact mechanisms by which a people were systematically kept from knowing themselves, knowing their rights, knowing their history, and knowing their power. And the mechanisms are still running. What these 5 chapters make undeniable is this. The miseducation was not a side effect. It was not collateral damage. It was not ignorance. It was the point. The professional exclusion, the political erasure, the manufactured misleaders, the cultivated self-contempt, the internalized competition. These were outputs of a system that worked exactly as designed to create Suboptimal people believing in suboptimal worldviews. And the counter move, the one that Woodson is pointing towards, is not more leadership. It is not more performance. It is self-knowledge. It is service. It is actually pulling what we have and building what we need and refusing to measure our worth by standards that are designed to make us fall short. We've been new. We are just reclaiming what was always ours to know. And that's episode 3. And so next week, we're going to be finishing the Miseducation of the Negro. And I have a feeling that these last few chapters are going to open some things up. So thank you for being here. This work means everything to me. And the fact that you're doing it alongside with me, that really matters. So be sure to take care of yourselves out there.